We will continue with the series with more on the fall of Adam, but with the texts beyond the book of Genesis, focusing mostly on the writings of the Apostle Paul. Throughout this video series, it has been demonstrated that the view of ex nihilo creation is an extra-biblical assumption, a doctrine which would render theology incompatible with free will. It is a dogma which provides a strong case against God on the basis of the philosophical problem of evil and suffering. The doctrine of ex nihilo also distorts the interpretation of Scripture, which also distorts our view of what and who God is, and how God's dealing with man are just and fair. Regarding the creation and the fall of Adam, traditional ex nihilo theology presents a scenario whereby creatures created by God are faulted for not living up to the standards that God set for them. The disobedience of the first man and woman is answered by a punishment and curse upon their children, spirits who God has not yet created. Following the fall of Adam, God then creates creatures with a sin nature out of nothing, knowing that these creatures are damned forever unless God decides to save them. And according to fundamentalists, God will only save a small percentage of the billions who have lived on this earth. Again, at a quick glance, ex nihilo appears to be impressive. Creation out of nothing. However, upon closer investigation and deep thought, it is a rather disturbing proposition. In the book of Romans, we find that the wages of sin is death. And since our being consists of both physical and spiritual components, there are two kinds of death. There's spiritual death, separation from God's presence, and physical death, separation of the spirit from the physical body. What sin has an infant child committed in order to deserve such punishment? Why is it fair to punish children for the sins of their parents? Such accusations against God are not new. In those days they shall say no more, the fathers have eaten a sour grape, and the children's teeth are set on edge. But every one shall die for his own iniquity, every man that eateth the sour grape. Indeed, the Lord had stated, fathers shall not be put to death for their children, nor children put to death for their fathers. Each is to die for his own sin. Skeptics may refer to the law of Moses or God's consequences to the fall of Adam with doubts. Without men breaking God's specifically expressed law, God cannot fairly accuse those people of sin and sentence them to separation from God and physical death or mortality. Each person should be punished for their own specific acts, which are performed individually, and they should not be punished for someone else's actions. It is unfair to punish someone according to a law or a set of laws that they could not fully understand, or worse, a law that they were not given. I argue here, and I will say that Paul the Apostle argued centuries ago, that the criticisms leveled against God are not valid, because a limited perspective is not allowing people to see the deeper truths which Paul the Apostle himself explains and can only be understood fully in the ex materia mindset. Before going into the New Testament, let's look at an overview of the different kinds of sin. Sin can refer to original sin and personal acts of sin. As previously explained, original sin can refer to lacking divine characteristics. It applies to every non-divine spirit. This is something internal within us. In this sense, all sinned and all face mortality as a consequence. Then there's personal acts of sin, which can also be broken down into smaller categories. You can have transgressions of God's given law to those who do not fully understand the law or do not understand good and evil. This would apply to the personal acts of sin of Adam and Eve in the garden which caused the fall. Then you have sin against God's divine standards when no specific law was available. Paul also speaks about this, and we can think of it as sins against your conscience. And finally, we have sins against God's given law to those who do understand it and do understand good and evil. These are the worst kind. Now, the scriptural text does not usually specify as to what kind of sin is being referred to, although, in the end, all of these spiritual failings need to be dealt with. The Apostle Paul's writing on the subject is some of the most difficult content in the New Testament, but really becomes simpler if you understand what I have described. Let's look at how Paul views sin. There are personal acts or works that are judged, like an account of the choices we make. The works are either good or evil, and each individual could legally be held accountable for each sin committed. God does not hold us accountable for the personal works or individual sins of others. However, the sin of being spiritually unholy, impure, imperfect, and so forth comes from within our spirits and is the root cause of all sin. Inside ourselves, the potential for sin is there even before we do anything, even before we are born. So let's start with Romans 5, verse 12. Through one man sin entered the world, and death through sin. And thus death spread to all men because all sinned. How is it possible that all sinned when the people of the earth had not yet been born? Well, our spirits did exist when this event occurred, and we all fell below divine expectations. Adam and Eve, in the physical world, vicariously represented all of the spirits who chose to enter mortality, as all submitted to the truth which God presented. We all lacked divine traits. This is the reason that death is a consequence for all of us. Hence, Paul says, death spread to all men because all sinned. The choice of words is interesting, as it does not say that sin started or began. Paul says that it entered the world. Sin already existed within all of us in the premortal spiritual realm, as we were all lacking the same divine characteristics as Adam lacked. Only we had not yet been placed in the position to demonstrate our unrighteousness in the flesh. We bring sin with us when we, as imperfect spirits, are able to act within this physical arena. Imagine God explaining to all these spirits that they are lacking in divine characteristics, and those who accepted this truth would trust God and understand that entering mortality is a way to learn to overcome our inherent flaws and gain experience. God also designed a real situation which would demonstrate to us the problems we have by taking two choice spirits, veiling their memories, and placing them in a paradisical state in the garden. God was able to demonstrate our failings and thus fairly enact the consequences which set in motion the plan to save us from our non-divine spirituality. Back to the New Testament and Paul's epistle to the Romans, he writes, "For until the law, sin was in the world, but sin is not imputed when there is no law. Nevertheless, death reigned from Adam to Moses, even over those who had not sinned according to the likeness of the transgression of Adam." So what is Paul talking about? First, let's discuss imputed sin. Imputation of sin is all about assigning blame or responsibility. Each is responsible for one's own sin. People are not responsible for the personal transgressions of Adam and Eve, having directly disobeyed God's command in the garden. That goes towards Adam and Eve's personal accounts. People not living under the law of Moses cannot be held responsible, imputed, for disobeying it. But why does death spread to all men, and why was there sin and death in the world beyond just Adam and Eve, and before the law of Moses? People are born into mortality and death. Personal acts of sin in the flesh, or direct disobedience to God, acted out, like Adam and Eve did in the garden, were not the reason why death reigns over us. Our own inherent sin nature is the reason, which is why in verse 12, Paul had explained that all sinned. Paul understood that blame should not be assigned, imputed, to those who did not break the law of Moses or to people not personally in the garden because they had not been given the laws or commands and did not break them. The likeness or similitude of Adam's transgression. Each of us did not face a Garden of Eden scenario, yet we face the same consequences. God set up a situation whereby he could demonstrate the failings of Adam and Eve's very nature. The children of Israel's inability to follow God's written law also exposed their nature. People are still subject to death even when they did not commit a sin or act of disobedience to God's expressed laws, in the likeness or similitude of Adam's transgression, because of inherent sin. Inherent sin may be imputed to us because we have a flawed spiritual nature, as did Adam and Eve. If my spirit and my wife's spirit had been placed into the bodies in the Garden of Eden, we would have fallen in the same way. The group here who's begging the question are children. Consider children who die in innocence. Children did not disobey a direct command by God, and they did not break any of the laws of Moses. So blame or responsibility cannot be imputed to them for Adam's transgression or sins against the law of Moses or any other law. They did not commit a sin in the likeness of Adam's transgression, because they were not under those laws. Yet they still die. On the one hand, Paul correctly claims that we ourselves all sinned the original sin of being spiritually unholy in various ways, even as Adam and Eve were unholy. This is why it was just and fair that they act on our behalf, revealing how we are all guilty of the same sin of falling short of the divine standard. Original sin is rightly imputed by God upon all of us. On the other hand, Paul needs to address personal acts of sin, which also were made possible through Adam and Eve's decision. By the one man's offense, death reigned. Judgment came upon all men to condemnation. By one man's disobedience, many were made sinners. So, Adam and Eve enter mortality and have children, which allows the spirits of mankind to enter mortality. In terms of personal works, God considers these spirits to be pure and innocent. No act of sin has been committed by that individual until they come to grow and understand right and wrong. As previously explained, impure spirits will inevitably sin in mortality, and acts which are good or evil are placed under their personal account. We cannot take made sinners here to be referring to original sin, in which we are inherently sinful by nature, because in context it is paralleled with made righteous, referring to justification through Jesus Christ. Also, take note that it says in verse 12, referring to original sin, that we were all sinners. Yet here it says many were made sinners. So, in terms of personal sin, let's go through this and see how many were made sinners through Adam. Non-divine spirits enter the physical bodies of the children of Adam and Eve. We inherit mortality and death through Adam. We inherit the knowledge of good and evil. Either good or bad choices will be made as we age with this knowledge of good and evil. Imperfect spirits who reach an age of accountability in mortality will inevitably sin. These will be personal sins on our account. This is how, through Adam and Eve's disobedience, many were made sinners. Sin brings with it judgment and condemnation. For centuries, Christians believed that baptism was meant to deal with the problem of original sin instead of dealing with personal acts of sin. This led to the practice of infant baptism because people believed that God would condemn little children to everlasting damnation. To this day, Christians still tend to believe that God creates the spirits of children out of nothing with a sinful nature. Next, I provide an alternative view in Ex Materia, the Sons of God.